Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
For those extremely thoughtful remarks. I think we've all just seen why, in addition to many other titles within the Alliance, you're known informally as the Great Communicator.
Oof.
I'd like to start with a theme that has emerged throughout the course of our day-long discussions, which is how to strike a balance between continuity and change occurring within the Alliance. And you mentioned in your remarks just a moment ago that the military alliance is currently undergoing a major transformation. This transformational journey began a few years ago, but it's really picked up speed in the last 2-3 years with a focus on updating guidance and ensuring the right tools are in place. This year, of course, we're now transitioning into the next phase with a focus on implementation and executability. And as part of that transition, NATO headquarters, in addition to national staffs, are currently having to relearn how to do a lot of things that, frankly, they haven't done in many years, such as how to sustain the demands of high-intensity warfare in a European theater. And this wartime transformation, which, as your colleague Admiral Bauer, the chairman of the military committee earlier this year, called it, this wartime transformation marks a departure from the peacetime and crisis time mindset of the organization. So first, can you provide an update on how the Alliance's ongoing transformation, the plans, the authorities, the C2 is progressing? And second, could you help us understand from a holistic perspective how the Alliance's return to this pre-war footing better positions it to respond effectively to emerging threats and challenges?
Yeah, absolutely. It's important that we talk about this for a minute because these are really profound changes. So when we focused on out-of-area operations, crisis management, we optimized for the characteristics of those sorts of operations. And I think you could fairly say, without making too big of a blanket statement, that such operations were typically small in scale. They involve small units of action, say in the land domain, brigade-size organizations. They happened far away at a time and a place of our choosing. We chose to intervene. And so as a result of that, we could adopt a cyclical process of force generation, right? One unit's getting ready to go, the other unit's employed in the theater, another unit's standing down. And that cycle gave us predictability, regularity. It also gave us the unbelievable opportunity to economize every place in that cycle and outside that cycle except for that one unit that's deployed. And so we all merrily did that. I mean, that was one of the big things that enabled the nations in the alliance to take a peace dividend, our nation included. And we deconstructed and set aside many of the processes and many of the formations that are necessary for large-scale warfare, things above the brigade level, staying with the land domain, for example. In the air domain, things that were necessary to wage large-scale air campaigns. We didn't need that anymore, and so we put that aside. Some of it atrophied. We also adopted our readiness models. You only had to be ready when you were deployed. The rest of the force did not have to be ready. Completely inappropriate for collective defense. Now we have to be focused on specific areas that we are always ready to defend, which is the basis of our deterrence. And so we need standing forces with directed levels of readiness maintained on a continuous basis. Whereas during out-of-area operations, a headquarters could be used to do anything. You could say, well, we're going to send you to Afghanistan next. Now, headquarters are focused on particular pieces of geography. They have to become the masters of the war in that area. So their focus changes. Above all, what we get out of this is a requirement for forces above the small unit level. We need the enablers at division levels. We need division headquarters. We need air operations centers. We need all of these things, these structures necessary for large-scale warfare, and we need the habits and the practices to go along with it. So the change is absolutely profound. And it's not without pain, and it's not without friction. All of our own militaries go through it. Each one of the militaries in the alliance is having to go through it individually as a national force, and now we're going through it collectively as an alliance force. But the changes are very profound. What is gratifying is how quickly the forces of the alliance are adapting to it. We had a new force model instead of the cyclical force model. We've adopted, you could call it a pyramidal force model with tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 forces. In the first series of force sourcing conferences against the new regional plans, it made a 700% jump in the amount of force that nations pledged to make available to SACEUR in the event of the activation of the plans. So it's a dramatic change. There's a lot of work left to be done, as I'm sure you can imagine, but I believe we're all committed to making it happen.
Fantastic, thank you. Yes, the changes are indeed profound, and as I tell my students on an almost weekly basis, it's certainly a very exciting time for the Alliance. I want to turn to this question of geography that you mentioned, and I also want to stay on this theme of old versus new for a moment longer. The current strategic environment shares some parallels with earlier periods for the Alliance's history, but there are also some significant differences. So during the Cold War, NATO addressed allies' uneven threat exposure by stationing large multinational formations on the front lines so that all the nations of the Alliance had skin in the game, so to speak. But the geography of the frontline states today is very different, as is the composition of the allied nations' military forces, as you touched upon. So in some sense, every state is now a frontline state because of the proliferation of hybrid activities by adversaries. So my question is, how do you balance this 360-degree approach, the diverse threats that each region faces, and the requirement to have 3 joint force commands that are not only fit for purpose, but also equally capable? And is there a risk that the ongoing reforms to the Alliance's military structures could lead to each region becoming more inward-looking, thereby potentially diluting each member's stake in the defense of other regions?
Well, that's a simple question. Let me I'd like to meet the person who wrote that one for you.
Sorry, that was me.
That was you. I think there are 3 big things I'd like to pull out of it.
Please.
Because you put your finger on really important things, right? The first is this question of 360-degree approach. It sounds like a slogan, but it's really not. When you look at the Alliance has to respect the threat pictures of each of its members individually as well as collectively. And, if you're in the southern tier of the Alliance, if you're, say, Spain, you're very worried about threats emanating from Africa as well as the general threat of Russia and terrorism. So first of all, geographically, it's necessary. It's also very necessary when you're talking about our 2 named adversaries to remember that there is no rear area in a sense. Russian cruise missiles can come from west to east just as easily as from east to west, which suddenly reverses our idea of front and rear. Terrorism, of course, comes from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. The second thing is, when you consider all domains, some domains are not geographical at all. And that means the threat is omnipresent, and we have to be able to deal with it in that sense. So this question of 360-degree threat, I think, is a very important principle for us to maintain. We are not a one-problem alliance. That would be nice, but that's not us. That's the first thing I'd say. I'd say the second thing is this question of inward-looking regional plans. There has to be one theater manager above all of that to balance our efforts among the 3 and to put the focus where it needs to be at any given time, and in fact, to choose where the focus in the initiative should be. That's our job at the Supreme Headquarters. So SHAPE has been undergoing a transformation for about the last 1.5 years in which we're turning it back into a strategic warfighting headquarters. We shouldn't be confused here. I'm not trying to say we're turning it into a battalion headquarters or a squadron headquarters, but we are returning SHAPE's focus back to Allied command operations and to focusing on how you run a theater of war, and in peacetime, how you run a theater of deterrence across multiple areas simultaneously. So those are a couple of very important features of what we're up to.
Great, thank you. And I should probably have stated that that question was partly informed by my visit to JFC Norfolk about 10 days ago. So I know there are exciting things happening down there as well. Yes. We've been discussing throughout the day, and you have touched on as well, this emphasis on relearning operational best practices from the Cold War. But I'd like to ask you about the strategic level, which is something that's come up on several of the panels today. Are there insights we can glean or pitfalls we should avoid in that regard, particularly in light of Russia's nuclear saber rattling and the fact that we, quite frankly, have a leadership in Moscow right now that's prone to conspiracy theories? So some analysts in Washington at the moment worry that we lack the finely calibrated tools of escalation management that we had during the Cold War, while others argue there's no such thing as escalation control and warn that we're headed for a very dangerous future if we think we can manage escalation in a crisis between nuclear powers. So how do we strike a balance between being prepared and ready, communicating that message, with the risk of unintended escalation? And in other words, how do we deter our adversaries without setting off a spiral of escalation?
Right. So I think the big background fact here is that we used to have a very, very fine and mutually understood vocabulary for signaling each other between the West and the Soviet Union, between NATO and the Soviet Union. We could read each other's signals. We knew how to send signals to each other. We knew how to communicate verbally and non-verbally about our intentions in a way that gave predictability to the other side and gave comprehension to the other side. And this was one of the principal things that we used to manage escalation and to achieve deterrence without significant risk. We also had a number of structures, and we had the infrastructure, as it were, physical and non-physical, to communicate these to each other. We had treaties, we had organizations, supranational organizations that we used to do all that. After the Cold War, we had on-site inspections and things like that. Almost all of that's gone now. So we fell out of the habit of practicing with this vocabulary, as it were, of signaling. We fell out of the habit of using the mechanisms to signal, and we've at this point walked away from many of we collectively have walked away from many of the arrangements and the fora and the treaties that previously gave us the ability to do this. So I think the big background fact is that we used to be really good at this, and we as a globe fell out of practice. We have been resurrecting that practice, and we have been working that very hard. I think there's a much finer understanding of deterrence management and escalation management, two very different things, although related, different. I think there's a much finer understanding of how to move those mechanisms now and how to move that than we did. We have been reestablishing these practices as we go along. I think it's important to note that the world that we're doing this in is complicated in a couple of ways that it wasn't during the Cold War. First of all, we're trying to reestablish it during a hot war that's being waged by one of the parties in this deterrence question. The second is there are no longer just two principal parties to the deterrence question, right? There's China in the background, and how all this is going to interact on a three-way basis will be a very, very important question. I think that our ability to manage, to sustain deterrence and manage escalation is going to be a key to the way we go forward. It's pretty clear, to me anyway, although I'm sure it's the subject of much debate, that the strategic stability paradox continues to exist. The strategic nuclear stalemate, deterrence that's established at the upper level does give rise to opportunities for great instability below it, and we have to reconnect those and reestablish the ways of managing those together. How do we go ahead doing all of this and reestablishing our collective defense capability without being threatening and accidentally having an effect we don't want? Well, I think the first step is to describe ourselves openly as what we are, a defensive alliance. I probably used the word defense, defend, defensive about 10 times during a short speech. There's a reason for that. We have to communicate to others, as well as to ourselves, that we are in this for defense and the deterrent value that that gives us short of defense. So I think that's the first step. And then our actions have to back that up.
Fantastic, yes, and cross-domain or integrated deterrence is something I know that the Alliance is also thinking a lot about. And we heard this morning and over the course of the day about the need to dust off some of those old theories of deterrence and get some of that nuclear IQ back. So it's a very important.
But like everything else, I think we have to dust them off, but we have to shine new light on them also, right? Yeah. It's very easy to talk about return to the past, back to the future, and things like that, but the situations are different. Some of the mechanisms are going to look very familiar. Some of the things that we do will reestablish some things, but the context is so different, and we should be careful about that as well.
Excellent point, thank you. I want to turn to the war in Ukraine next. There's an important distinction, one which I think is often lost on the wider public, between the role NATO allies as sovereign nations have played in supporting the government and people of Ukraine in their courageous efforts to repel Russian forces, either bilaterally or through the US-led Ramstein Group, the Defense Contact Group, and the actions that NATO as a political military alliance has taken, which have focused on non-lethal aid, or the recent announcement of the JTEC in Bydgoszcz, the Joint Training and Evaluation Center that will be stood up there. But we did see at last week's foreign ministerial meeting that Secretary General Stoltenberg announced that there's now agreement among the allies to proceed with, quote, planning for a greater NATO role, end quote, in the coordination of security assistance and training for Ukraine. He mentioned in his remarks that you've received an initiating directive for the NAC, tasking you to propose a framework to come up with a plan for some kind of NATO framework or machinery to coordinate, institutionalize the Allies' security assistance to Ukraine. So recognizing that this is very much early days, I wonder if you could share some of the considerations that may guide that study as it moves ahead.
Sure, there's no danger in me talking about things that are in the early stages. So I'll jump in. Yeah, so I think starting with the underlying principles is probably the most important thing. So the nations of NATO do not believe we are in a war with the Russian Federation, and we don't want to be in one.
Right. It's a defensive alliance.
The purpose of our alliance is to deter such a war. Right. And this accounts for the fact that almost all NATO nations have been supporting Ukraine on a bilateral basis, but on a alliance-wide basis, we have not chosen to be put into a position or to put ourselves into a position where we might be viewed as party to the conflict. This hasn't stopped us from doing some of our longer-term things, many of which were in place already: the Comprehensive Action Plan, Interoperability Roadmap, and all of the other things that are being done by NATO, especially NATO headquarters with Ukraine. So that's sort of the underlying principle for how to approach this. Nevertheless, there is an important desire among nations to bring Ukraine closer to the alliance. We described that at Vilnius, and to recognize the fact that we ultimately want Ukraine to be part of the security structure that we believe will benefit Europe and the globe. And so a tighter relationship in some ways is something that the nations have decided to explore. More specifically, they have tasked me as SACEUR to develop a plan for consideration on how to do that. And I'm in the process of doing that right now with my staff, and then it will be presented to nations for them to examine and to see whether or not it meets their political direction and guidance. That will happen, it won't take very long to do that, and then nations will have the opportunity to say, would like to do this, or we wouldn't like to do this, or how about if we take out that, and we'll proceed from there. So that's kind of exactly where it sits right now.
And with the timing being the July summit, I imagine.
Well, I think people would like that to be you know, everything heads toward the July summit, right? I mean, everybody would like everything to be there, but sometimes things don't fit. I think the important thing is, and I think all heads of state and government would agree, this will be an important decision, so we have to take it properly. We have to take our time with it and make sure that we decide deliberately, that we have thorough analysis and understanding of what we're trying to do and how it will work. So I think getting a quality decision will be more important to nations than getting a fast decision.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'd like to turn to some student questions that were submitted over the course of the day. The first student question is from Jan Gerber, who is one of our students from the Security Studies program who's actually graduating in a month's time, and he's from Poland. And you've touched on this a little bit, but I will ask you if you can elaborate. He asks, could you give us an update on the force sourcing process for the 300,000 high readiness troops and the new force model that NATO announced at Madrid? Have allies been able to agree on national commitments, including personnel, equipment, and enablers? So how is the force generation planning process going?
Yeah, so there are two parts to the force sourcing, and the first one's pretty easy. So we developed this new force model, Tier 1, Tier 2, Tier 3, readiness levels in different amounts of time that those forces need to be ready. And then we queried nations, and nations immediately said, I'll put this many into this tier, this many into this tier, this many into this tier. And that was the first step. And that's where the 300,000 number comes from, the 700% number, all of which are accurate, but that's only the first step. The second step was to take in detail the force structure requirements of the plans and to ask nations to assign organizations against those requirements. So country X says, I'll offer you a fighter squadron for that and a destroyer for that. We rapidly discovered that our existing method of force sourcing was suited to our previous method of operation, where we were trying to cyclically generate small units for a discrete period of time. And SACEUR, Admiral Keith Blount, he has been placed by me in charge of this process, and he had a great insight. He said, so the system isn't working properly, but we're not asking the question correctly. The real question is not, hey, what will you give me for this operation? The real question is, if we were really in a large-scale war,
what have you got?
With one of our named adversaries, what exactly is it that you couldn't give me, that you would have to reserve for a national mission, the United States guarding our airspace, for example? What would you have to hold back? Because we can presume everything else will be made available. And when nations looked at it that way, the number of organizations that they said, oh yeah, I would make all of this available to you, skyrocketed. So it went very well in that sense, and in many aspects of the force sourcing, we're where we need to be. In some notable ones, we are not, especially high-end enablers, long-range surface-to-air missile systems, logistic enablers, all the things that nobody wants to build when they're not absolutely necessary. But we've got a process called a NATO defense planning process, which is a cyclical process to examine what we want and to assign capabilities targets out to nations to build. This year, well, last year, Political Guidance 23, which is the document that drives this NDPP cycle, included for the first time in years the requirements of the plans as the principal input, instead of just capabilities we desire in the future. So now the NDPP building process is based on, in the near to midterm, the requirements of our plans. So we're in the process of going through that now and assigning out to nations, negotiating with nations, which parts of the empty boxes in the force structure they want to build.
Great, yes, and I know as part of the NDPP process, there's also capability reviews that are done every couple of years.
That's right, that's right.
Some countries have made those available and others haven't.
This is important because Philippe Lavigna, Supreme Allied Commander for Transformation, and I work on this very closely together, and with some people, I see Angus Lapsley sitting in the front row here, ASG Lapsley. So we work this process, and there's a tension, right? I'm the Allied Commander for Operations. I'm responsible, if something happened tonight, to make a plan work. So I need things now. My plans are really based on existing capabilities and existing stuff. But 20 years from now, I don't want my kids fighting the same way I'm required to fight by reality. I want them to fight in a new way, right? In a way that's cleverer, that's got better equipment and things like that. So we also want to modernize. We have a vision for the future. Philippe is in charge of that. And he develops that and brings it to nations, and heads of state and government approve his concepts. And so inside this defense planning process, across the multi-year time horizon for building forces, what we've done this time is the early years are devoted to near-term readiness requirements, i.e. the stuff I put in there, and the midterm and out years are Philippe's to fill with the capabilities we want someday, although we do talk about it so that there will be an evolution as we go forward.
Great, thank you. I want to turn to our next student question, which comes from Ashley Kelso, who is also a student in the Security Studies program, class of 2025, and it touches on this question or theme of vision to the future that you just touched on. How does climate change impact NATO's strategic priorities and influence defense planning? And here I should probably note that I teach a class in international security, and for the first time in my decade-long journey of teaching that class, all of my students, all 18, rank climate change as the #1 international security challenge.
Okay.
So I was.
Then they should get on it immediately.
So how does climate change impact NATO's strategic priorities and influence defense planning?
Two principal ways, although they are not immediate, right? So it would be an interesting conversation with your students. I think someday they could be correct, but today those pressures are not necessarily acute in the military sphere. But this is where it's going and where it could become hugely problematic. The first one is the retreat of the polar ice cap. This is opening up the northern passage for the Russians, giving them new water space in which they can maneuver, and is also giving China a new approach to Europe. And given the increasing interrelationship between the goals, the strategies of China and Russia, that could become highly problematic to us in the future. And it would be problematic for the alliance as an alliance. There are 8 nations in the Arctic Council. 7 of them are members of NATO, and the other one is the Russian Federation. So clearly, there's something about the retreating polar ice cap that will be very important to us. It will also change technically some of the way we do things in the high north, like sub hunting and things like that. Hunting for subs will change with the extent of the polar ice cap as well. The second big way is if you drop to the southern edge of the alliance's area, the increasing desertification of the Sahel and the competition for water resources specifically, growing food insecurity in Africa. When you put that together with the unbelievable youth bulge in Africa, we have a very big challenge coming over the next 30 years for Europe. The problems that populations experience in Africa are going to promote larger scale migration, and that's already sort of a neuralgic issue in Europe. I think we can well expect the challenges to security in Africa to become closer and closer linked to those inside Europe. As I said earlier, our southern allies feel that acutely already. As we go forward, I think climate change could very well make that more widely felt across the alliance. And if it bothers Europe, it bothers NATO. There are a million other ways climate change could be involved and could pose challenges, but I think those are 2 very direct ones that we can see in the midterm future at the latest.
And of course, the alliance will be discussing the Southern Flank strategy at the upcoming July Washington Summit as well, so that'll come up there as well. Thank you. The next question I have is from Ryan Usawati, who is a SSP student, class of 2024. He asks, considering the proliferation of political interference operations, is NATO the appropriate forum for combating these types of hybrid warfare threats? We've talked a lot about political interference, disinformation, and how it relates to the alliance today.
This is a great question because the answer applies to so many other things in the alliance. So everybody knows that the Washington Treaty, you know, the money chapter is Article 5, right? Article 5, which is the mutual defense guarantee.
But the
right?
preamble.
Right. But Article 3 states that each member nation is responsible for its own security and for its own defense. And I always point out to people that 3 comes before 5, which is important. So when we think about physical collective defense, you know, the regional plans and everything, the first step is for countries to have a national defense plan that is resourced, and for us to find out how NATO can reinforce that and then subsume it if necessary, right? I think it's the same thing inside things like disinformation. The first step is a country has to harden itself against disinformation. You know, if we're talking about political meddling, it's not the place of the alliance in first place to go into country Y and say, we're going to help you with, you know, this very subtle internal political disinformation campaign. That's really the nation's business. The alliance certainly has structures to help and does help, but it begins with the nation defending itself against those. Second, to accept help from NATO, ask for help from NATO structures, and go forward from there. And only after that should we contemplate something bigger. We do have a very active strategic communications program. We do have very active disinformation programs, but I'm just calling attention to the fact that the first step in combating this, you know, speaking as an American, our first step is to try to deal with it ourselves. And then after that, to look abroad for help.
Absolutely, and national resilience is something that the 2 newest members of the alliance do quite well. So
yeah.
Perhaps there are lessons there from them for others.
There's a ton to learn from Sweden's total defense program.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. All right, I think we have time for one more student question. This comes from Eric Urabi, SSP student class of 2024 as well. Since 2022, many NATO allies have provided some of their most modern and previously unexploited weapons to Ukraine: Leopards, Bradley, Patriots, HIMARS. Russia has been able to exploit or mitigate those weapons. How does the loss of the technical advantage of some of these weapons affect the future warfighting strategy of NATO? And what is being done to regain any lost advantages in weapons technology? We heard earlier today from David Sanger, who has a new book coming out, and of course, General Milley also talked about this previously, about this weird interplay that we have in Ukraine, where we have elements of World War I, elements of World War II, and also elements of future warfare.
Sure. The first thing I'd say is that things like this are a two-way street. So Ukraine, Russia may be learning some things about our technical capabilities, perhaps, but I would imagine that we're probably learning some about theirs as well. And so I think it's fair to say that militaries all over the world are studying this conflict pretty closely to see what works and what doesn't work. So I think on balance, I'm not extremely worried about the loss of technical superiority from this. I would point out that it's our responsibility to keep a good, close eye on where technology ends up going and on where capacity ends up going too, just the systems themselves. And we do that, you know, we do that as a nation, the United States does. I've got a part in it, but I don't have the whole problem in my hands. I share that with a number of other agencies and everything. But it's a valid question. There's another question, though, and that's in terms of the transfer of capacity to Ukraine, right? Mm-hmm. It's been done as we could do it in some cases, especially early on. And so at some point, we're going to have to get in there with the Ukrainians and with our colleagues. We're going to have to roll up our sleeves and figure out how to homogenize the fleets, how to distribute the equipment carefully and evenly across their formations, and sort of regularize things, because only by then can you really establish the institutional logistical systems and everything to sustain the readiness that clearly they're going to need to deter Russia for some years to come.
Great, thank you. I'd like to ask my final question now, which is going to conclude our discussion by circling back to where we began and ask a question about NATO's ability to adapt to a rapidly changing security environment. There's every indication that the international security environment is only going to become more complex and challenging in the coming years, not less. And I've been working on NATO adaptation for many years now, and one of the recurring themes I've heard from allies during that time is that NATO will eventually figure out how to do it, but that as an organization it struggles with long-term planning, that it's not very good at having a long-term perspective. So we're meeting here today just days after the 75th anniversary, but I'd like you to peer into the future and speculate a little bit about the alliance's longer-term prospects and the challenges that it could face in 25 years' time when we all reconvene in Gaston Hall, this time to celebrate the centenary of NATO's founding. So what sorts of challenges might we find ourselves discussing then, and will the alliance be adequately prepared to address them?
I did the math, and I'm hoping to be here. In fact, I'm badly hoping to be here. So I think in 25 years, this alliance will still be facing the same challenges it does, because the alliance really has an important values-based component to it, right? This alliance will still be lined up against authoritarian regimes, regimes that do not seek to govern by the consent of the governed, that sort of thing. We are still going to be together, and there are going to be still countries out there that are opposed to that. And I think that's very important. I think we can anticipate that there is going to be an important military component to that still. I think that component is going to be both conventional and non-conventional, as well as unconventional, right? So we'll have nuclear, conventional, and hybrid different types of activities and conflicts that we'll face. I think clearly space will be much more important then than it is today, and it's pretty important today. I think some things will continue to endure, though. You know, I sometimes tell people that the great irreducible feature of warfare is hard power, right? You can have all the cyber, you can have all the information operation, you can have everything, but if the other guy wants to fist fight you, you're going to end up in a fist fight. So our ability to keep the peace by being ready for the hard part of warfare, si vis pacem para bellum, that is going to continue to be true this whole time, well into the future. And it's our duty to get to that future by being ready today, and it's our duty to be ready for that future by thinking ahead to the future and working with nations to build the sorts of forces we'll need then.
Vigilance is the price of liberty, the SHAPE motto. I think that's a perfect place to end. Thank you for joining us today at Georgetown. It's been a tremendous honor, sir. I want to express my personal gratitude to you, not only for our conversation today, but for your daily efforts in transforming the Alliance so that it truly is fit for purpose. We're very fortunate to have you in this role right now. Please thank me in joining the Supreme Allied Commander, General Cavoli.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you. Please, sir. Thank you all. Before we wrap up today's program, I want to extend my personal gratitude to our distinguished speakers and panelists, many of whom traveled from Europe to join us today. Equally important, I want to thank the audience for your active engagement and interest in the Alliance. I know we were competing with an eclipse, but there'll be another one of those in, I think, 20 or so years, and NATO only turns 75 once. So I think you made the right choice. I also want to make an appeal, especially to the students and younger audience members, both in the room and online, to please stay engaged in the important work that NATO is doing to safeguard the peace and prosperity of our shared Euro-Atlantic community. NATO, perhaps now more than ever, needs your support and engagement. And the good news is that it's relatively easy, especially for those of you in the audience with us today, but also for those of you joining us from locations in other allied nations to remain engaged. This July 9th through July 11th, the heads of government of the 32 allies will be coming to Washington for the 75th anniversary summit, and they will be joined by heads of government from several NATO partner countries. The Washington summit will be an occasion to celebrate 75 years of historic achievements, but it will also be much more than just a party. As we heard today, it will be an important opportunity to underscore NATO's continued strength, unity, and yes, adaptation as it advances implementation of the most robust plans and reforms since the end of the Cold War. Alongside the summit, there will be a public forum held on the sidelines where students and young professionals can participate, along with many other public events and opportunities to learn more about NATO, all within your reach and in your backyard. I know the organizers of the summit and the public forums and NATO as a whole is quite keen on having your input, not just on the road to Washington, but also beyond. And apart from the upcoming summit, there are other ways of getting involved with NATO as well. The 2024 NATO Youth Summit will be taking place in Miami, Florida, and Stockholm, Sweden on May 13th. Registration is open through April 14th, and if you go to the website natouthsummit.com, all one word, you can apply for a sponsored seat, which will include travel and accommodation. And it's a great opportunity, almost enough to make me wish I was 18 again. It's open to anyone aged 18 through 35, by the way. But the bottom line is that NATO needs your input and your voice, and its leadership is standing by, ready to engage. So I very much hope that you will take up the challenge and the call of service, because you are the ones, not those of us up here on the stage today, who will ultimately determine whether the alliance is around in 75 years' time. So if today has ignited even a small spark of interest in you, then I and the other speakers and panelists will consider this conference a success. It's your engagement and commitment that will shape the future of the Alliance in the decades to come. And we in the Center for Security Studies and the Walsh School of Foreign Service certainly plan on staying engaged as well. Thank you for your attendance, and please enjoy the rest of your afternoon.